Here we go. Okay, we are officially live. Hi, everybody. Hello, Facebook land, or however you're watching this video. Just make sure. Sorry, I'm getting notifications here. I've forgotten what I say for our introduction. It's been so long since we've done this. So we are the Institute for Erotic Intelligence. All three of us are a part of that and founding faculty. And we have a course coming up, starts in just under a month, The Source of Embodied Ethics. And it's for practitioners of all kinds. It's geared more toward somatic sex educators because that's what we are, and that's where our attention, or it's some of what we do, and that's where our attention is. But it's really for all practitioners. And you can learn more about that on our website, instituteforoticintelligence.com. And I'll include that link in the comments. And so with that, do I hand it over to you, Christian?
You can totally hand it over to me. Yeah, and then I'm going to just lob these fabulous fallacies right back to both of you, and we can wrestle with them. Yeah, I mean, it seems like, let's put ethics in a context. It's I think for a few years now, we have been, I would say, confronted really with our shadow, particularly in this culture. And it came from, I think it was shocking, I think, for a lot of us to come into this sense of, oh, so many people are doing so many bad things. And of course, it's not all of a sudden, but something shifted in the nature of our culture, and perhaps in social media and in power dynamics, to allow, to make it possible for people with less power, in particularly in traditionally less powerful roles, to say, this is happening. This is happening. The Me Too movement is a phenomenal example of this. And the tidal wave of that grassroots process that just took over, that has really created this tenor of unraveling, like that we have this idea that where our ethics are just unraveling all of a sudden. And it's right that they're unraveling all of a sudden, because we never really had them. So it's sort of like the Jenga thing, that we realized that we were teetering on this really poor foundation, this so-called ethical foundation, but we really didn't really have a foundation. And so we're circling back around now, particularly to support body-based practitioners who are on the front lines of ethical decisions. If we want to stay well and useful and dynamic and attentive and attuned to our clients, we cannot rely on carpet lists of thou shalt not and thou shalt, thou shall and thou shalt not. But then what do we do? What muscles do we cultivate? Are they internal? Are they external? What do we do? So moving from this idea of top down, outside in, carceral model, do this, don't do this, to a much more organic, in the moment, on the front lines, attuned, aware, and risky navigation. So on that note, we have a few, I think one of the things that's really struck me as I've been talking with supervising clients for more than a decade now, and just in my own practice, is realizing that we have, in this absence of a true, real endogenous or organic ethic that would be different for each of us, but perhaps constellating around some commonalities, we've clung to these fallacies. We like to say myths here, but I don't like to say myths because then we just totally trash the idea of myths. So we're not going to use myths. We're saying fallacies and fantasies about ethics that actually set us up to have blind spots, to feed shadow parts, to potentially cause harm, set us up to cause harm. And we're only going to handle potentially 2 of them today. We might not even get past 1 because they're so big. And the one that I think we should start with is the one that I wrote about in this week. For anyone who saw that email, it's up on our Facebook page. And that fallacy has to do with good people and bad people. That good people, people who mean well, good people do good things. And it's the bad people who do bad things. It's the bad people who cause harm. That there is like, that can't be. She couldn't have done that. You must be wrong. Muse, you must be wrong. She couldn't have done that. She's such a good person. And what do we mean? What do we mean where does it come from? Where does this good and bad come from? Is there even an ounce of anything relevant in it? Are we saying anything of value when we identify somebody as a good person or a bad person? And what does it do to our capacity in the moment to navigate those real straights and narrows of our practices with our clients and in our communities with our colleagues and our students, if we believe that there are good people and there are bad people? So that's fallacy number 1. What do you think?
So many things. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind, which is sort of surprising, is that it keeps us blind to the sort of gradation of harm that's possible, because there's really obvious harm that happens, but then there's these smaller that most of us wouldn't miss, which is what bad people do, or people get labeled as a bad person for having done. But then there's these small things that happen in everyday interactions between client and practitioner that can be so harmful and subtly and like ongoingly harmful.
And maybe let's actually take time, slow down and take time to even just put some points on that spectrum that you're talking about, like really horrible harm, really egregious harm, and then there's subtle harm, and there's sort of subtle and ongoing harm, and there's single event harm. And so can you give some examples of the subtler harm that erode?
Yeah, I mean, I feel this often when I'm in the seat of the client in some way, when there's a subtle projection or assumption about what I'm experiencing that isn't checked out.
Mm-hmm.
Where someone's like, oh, they assume I'm sad about something or angry about something, which is fine. Like, we assume stuff all the time, but then the practitioner doesn't actually check it out, and check in with me to see if that's true, or give me space to sort of bounce back and share what actually is true about my experience. Feels like one of the most, I mean, it can be really subtle, and that one can be really big and obvious, but it just slowly wears away at trust and reliability in that person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm thinking, as you're describing that, Alyssa, I'm putting myself in the practitioner seat, and I'm imagining sitting across from you and seeing some sort of emotion move across your face and misattributing it. So I'm misattuning to you. And if I have this idea that I'm a good person, I really mean well, I do good work, I really show up. These are all the kinds of things like, man, she really shows up. She's really doing the work. She's a good person. These are all those taglines that seem to if I sit across from you really believing that about myself versus some really more useful things, some more ethical things about myself, um, I'm I'm probably less likely to question my assumptions.
Mm.
I'm probably less likely to be humble about what I think if I'm doing the work, I'm showing up, I'm a good person. Yeah, I really care about you. Yeah,
Mhm.
that's what I'm imagining as I listen to your example. Those are really important. The really important examples of harm that tends not to really get it tends to fall off the list. Those misattunements and misattributions, and one alone is a mini rupture. And if they happen over and over again, then they're potentially just as much of a rupture as if I invite you on a date, or something that we think of as just like, well, who would do that?
Mhm.
That's a bad person who does that.
Mhm. Mhm. And it feels, I want to be careful that it doesn't mean you have to get it right. The importance isn't for the practitioner to be getting it right.
Not at
It's
all.
the checking it out that actually matters.
Yep. And
So,
I'm less likely to check. I believe I'm less likely to check it out if I'm a good person. If I've got this thing like I'm a good person, then I'm less likely to be careful with myself over here. So I'm less likely to pause and say, "Oh, how did that land? Did I get that wrong?"
mhm.
Because I'm a good person.
That maybe feels like a bit of I get something feels,
It's probably underneath the conscious level of
yeah,
consciousness.
Oh,
yeah,
it's absolutely
yeah.
underneath the conscious level. But that's the
Mhm.
problem with this labeling.
Right, right. And I have an example from the practitioner side, and this is something that I have done, that I have fallen prey to on my own, which is this allegiance to accommodating, or to being there for them. And so as a practitioner, I've seen this in myself, and I've got to call myself out on it, where I've contorted what I would have imagined would be the way that I practice, or a good choice for how to run the show, when I have run into resistance. Like, oh, right, okay, I better, follow their lead, because otherwise they're not going to be served here, or they're not going to like me, is another one, and they're going to leave dissatisfied. And so I'm going to just sort of like go this way, even though I feel like maybe probably this way is better. And in doing so, disempower them, because I'm assuming that they're not going to want to go this direction, disempowering myself, putting
Yes,
myself in a place
yes.
that's just so compromised to my actual, could be value system or choice point. And yeah, it's a little embarrassing to say, but this is where I have a place where I have to watch myself,
Mhm.
to be perceived as being a good practitioner. Then
Uh,
that, and where I can get into allegiance with that, and then become a worse practitioner as a result.
yeah, yeah. Well, and as since Alyssa introduced the spectrum of ethical behavior, the spectrum of harm, or spectrum of unethical behavior, I guess more appropriately, that you're really filling in that subtle area that we wouldn't necessarily. You're there's a whole section or group of sections on that spectrum that really have to do with not with that have to do with this, um, not accepting the power that we have, not acknowledging the power we have, and um, which is actually our second the second fallacy that we're going to explore.
Can I
Yeah, yeah.
pause you both
Yeah,
for a second just to say, if you're watching now, if you're watching live and you have a question, or if you have some sort of example from your own life on either side of this, to feel free to drop that in to the comments. We'd love to hear it.
Are you
Okay.
watching that, Alyssa? I'm not.
I am.
Okay.
Yeah.
Phew.
I am.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. And what else do we want to say about this? These labels and what's actually happening there we've got these categories of we have, it's not just practitioners that we put in these categories of good and bad, but this is the terrain we're talking about. What are we saying about a person? What are we even saying about a person? Are we saying anything valuable about a person when we say, but she's such a good person? What are we even referring to there? She means well. She doesn't drown kittens. What she what helps her neighbor out who's in her 70s or 80s. What are we saying about her? And is there a more accurate way to say that? How do we identify if we're not saying about ourselves, but I'm a good person?
Well, it occurs to me like it would be great to just bring in more specificity. One thing with me, Christiane, I like to say that I hate things like I hate goat cheese, and that's the one that comes to mind all the time. But it's not particularly useful information, and it doesn't open up any nuance or area for exploration and conversation around it. It's just like so it's like, this is a good person, end of story. This is a bad person, end of story.
Yes, end of
And
story.
so it doesn't really say anything. Muse, you look like you're about to explode.
Well, that's one of the things that I've been thinking about, is that it lets us be rigid. It lets us put someone in a compartment, or it doesn't let us be rigid. It puts people into compartments. And so it tries to like clean up this messy business of life.
Oh goodness, isn't that amazing? But just clean it up.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. But if I can know you're here, and if I know you're there, if I know that you voted for Trump, then you're a racist, then that case closed. I'm done with you,
Mm-hmm.
or and so it tries to, it attempts at making something that's very messy neat.
Yeah, and this is a really juicy ethical place here. This way that certainly our society and many have created these categories so that messiness gets put into the shadow. We get to just put it away, like our garbage on the curb every Wednesday morning. It goes away. And then what happens with us if our job is to sit on the front lines of the just most messy, most irrational, most non-linear, and especially if we're working with somebody's physical body and the terrain of their eros and their arousal and their, even if we're psychotherapists, we're in that terrain. We might not be touching them, but we're in that terrain. So what happens to our capacity, the musculature of us as practitioners, if we have allowed ourselves to fall prey to this box? Yeah.
I just want to say, speaking of messy, my computer's about to die. I'm gonna go get my cord. Very human mistake there.
Yeah, I'm sure if you were a good person, it wouldn't have happened. Yes. Yeah. So, yeah, I don't know if is there more that we want to say about that? These are really thought points.
Yeah, I mean, I just run through, I wrote about this in an email that went out a while ago, I think before the end of the year, but just that, like, I often go back to situations like Nazi Germany during World War II, before and during, where you can't dismiss an entire country as bad. I mean, I guess you could, but that doesn't help you understand anything about what went on there.
Yeah.
And so it's just so interesting, where it's like, what what's actually happening when people do the things that they do, because it's so much more complicated than being good or bad, and it leaves us vulnerable to stepping into bad behavior, unethical behavior, because we're not bad, and so then we could more easily fall into it because we're not tracking it in ourselves.
Yes. Yeah, it really, I think the more vehement we are about somebody else's bad behavior, the more likely there is something in us that is getting activated there, and not just this very right sort of community driven righteousness as opposed to self-righteousness. But the more vehement we are in our othering and monstering of other people, the more dangerous we become.
Mm-hmm.
And the more likely we're slicing off actually quite significant parts of ourselves that are thoroughly capable in certain situations and conditions of doing all sorts of atrocious things, as well as subtly harmful things, all sorts of things.
Well, and if we live at these categorizations, then we make it more difficult to get humble and to take ownership when we do those things that only a bad person would do.
Yes.
You know, then that part of us just we could never say anything to anybody about it, or we rationalize that, oh, well, this was, you know, and rather than like sitting in the fire of that poor decision and taking ownership. And you know, just kind of to bring back my earlier example, I've had to, you know, go back to a client and say, you know what, I did something last week, and I gave away my power to you, and I don't know that I said that, but you know, I did something last week, and I want to clean it up and make that repair. And thankfully, I've got a good enough support system, and not living in these rigid boxes that if I did something wrong or if I made a mistake, it equals I'm a bad person. So I was able to do that, or I'm usually able to do that. But I can also really feel that impulse of like, oh, I better hide that. I better hide that I did that, because that could mean then someone could really think that I'm a bad person or a bad practitioner, or yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's so much language in here that feels very important. That is that really some of this vocabulary is really almost like the foot soldiers of the carceral system, like good and bad, right and wrong. And even as you say, I did something wrong. What happens if we don't use that word? Because we certainly know that intention isn't impact, not always. And that's one of the greatest areas, ethical, subtle areas of our profession, is that our intention does not always equal impact. And that doing something that's specifically against the rules, i.e. wrong, doesn't always cause harm. It's not always, and these we don't talk about. This is the thing we do not talk about, you know, is that we could actually do something that's specifically against the rules, that's so clearly right in this moment, exactly right. And so there are all these areas where this black and white carceral vocabulary does not support us to actually be serving our clients in a client-focused, client-centered way.
I know we'll be talking a lot about that in our course that's coming up.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, and that has lots of roots. I mean, in order to do something that is really, really specifically against the rules, we have to have so much support and so much transparency in our practice, and so much of that humility to be working in a way that dances very gracefully with the P word, which is the next thing we're going to talk about. I'm not going to say it yet. You already said it. But shall we go for another one here?
I think we should, because we only have
a couple more minutes. Well, okay, yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, so Here it is. It's a big one. Take a deep breath. It's my ethical obligation to cultivate an equal relationship with my clients. And if I'm equal with them, I can't harm them. So we maybe worded this so that maybe it's a little bit, what's the word? Like deliberately
leading.
It's a deliberately kind of stirring. There's a word here I'm trying to think of. But this is actually something that people say. As a person who's been sitting with students and supervising for more than 10 years, this is actually something we say. I probably said this at one point or another. I've got to create an equal relationship with my clients. That's my job. The world is so full of inequity, so full of disparity, so full of injustice. It's my job to create this equal terrain where the P word has to come in at some point here. That word power, which has become in a lot of circles a really dirty word. But what are we doing if we're saying it's my ethical obligation? I mean, my clients, they're in a world full of inequity, and especially if we work with marginalized populations when it comes to sexuality and embodiment, who is not marginalized? And so there's this great spectrum of marginalization, from subtle to really, really gross and egregious. Gross as in large, deep. So what's happening there if we do that?
I mean, we're abandoning, or not even abandoning, not acknowledging the power that you as the practitioner have in that relationship, where it's never actually equal. You always have more power, more responsibility, more influence, more whatever we want to call it when you're in that role, which is why someone's coming to you.
Absolutely.
Like if you were equals, what's the point? Because you wouldn't actually be able to potentially help somebody. I mean, maybe you could, but you know, we're people are coming in for support around something usually.
Yep. And so we're equating power. We're saying, well, if I have power, if you and I, Alyssa, are doing in a relationship, and I have the power. Cedar Barstow would say up power, and I'm up power in that relationship. Then that means that you are down power in that relationship. It does not mean that you are disempowered. And that's a really important thing. I think that that's something that we end up assuming because we look at social injustice and we look at disparity and we look at disenfranchisement and we look at marginalization and we imagine that power is inherently wrong, but power is ecologically present in every single interaction. And you're saying that's why people come to us, because they're counting on us having more wisdom in this particular area and more capacity to guide and have a vision and understand a map and explore and lead. And that's necessarily power. So how would we turn that fallacy, that statement, that incorrect statement into a correct statement? Because this person who said this is pointing to something.
Something about taking responsibility for the power that is inherent in the relationship. Taking responsibility for that power up dynamic, so that it is power wielded in a healthy way and empowering for the client.
Exactly. So
that wasn't a statement, but it was
yeah. So it's my ethical obligation to cultivate an empowered relationship with my client. How does that sound?
I don't.
My ethical obligation to empower my client.
To use my power to empower my client.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think we're starting to get somewhere.
Yep.
I mean, there's something for me around like the what I hear in the core of that also is an acknowledgement that we're both human beings, and I'm not a better human being than my client. I'm just in a different role in this instance, and so we both have, power, worth, value, whatever you want to call it. And in this particular situation, I have more power, I'm up power, and here's the responsibility that comes with that, and here's the contract that we're stepping into. I can't get it as fine-tuned and simple as your statement, but there's a lot in it. It feels like.
Yes. Yeah.
And there's so much harm that can come from not acknowledging that we have more power in those relationships than our clients do.
Yes, yes, great harm. And also just sidestepping our role here, that we're here to lead and guide, and that's really what our clients are coming to us for. So if we're squeamish in any way, that perhaps leading, like I think your example is a really good one here, Muse. It's complex. You've got a couple of layers that you identified. Like, I don't want to disappoint my clients. I want to make the right choice. I want to be a good practitioner. I want to be an effective practitioner. So it's complex, but
it was not acknowledging my power or weakening that position by doing that sort of capitulation that was all actually living up in my head anyway, because it, not checking it out. Yeah.
Yes.
Great. So someone just asked, and I put it in the comments, but in case you're not watching this where there are comments, Christiane mentioned Cedar Barstow, who has written a book and has a whole body of work called The Right Use of Power, which is a great resource for all practitioners. It's written mostly with psychotherapists in mind, and it references other kinds of practitioners as well. It's great.
And other people in positions of power, people who are community leaders, people who are
clergy,
even parents. She'll reference situations and
certainly
dynamics with parents. Yes, because power is in every single interaction, necessarily in every single interaction.
Yeah, and we are all holding different kinds of power in different situations, and there's different layers to it.
Yeah. And this will be, just to wrap up here, then this will be a pretty good chunk of our Source of Embodied Ethics course through the IEI coming up in March. It will likely be a thread that weaves itself through all the pieces of the curriculum that we explore and navigate together, experience together, because it's
foundational.
It's foundational in every single interaction. So, and it's one of the things that I think a lot of folks, particularly in somatic sex education and sexological bodywork, have a really hard time with, because most of us come from a sense of marginalization in one way or another. So it's all the more critical that we really understand what we're up to and how to have right use of that power. So
cool. Well, you can learn more about all of that not about the book itself, but about the course we have coming up on our website, instituteforoticintelligence.com. And you can also email us if you have questions, or you can leave comments below or next to, however it shows up on your screen. Our email is info@instituteforoticintelligence.com, and we'll get back to you.
Mhm.
Thanks for joining us. And we'll see you soon.